are so awesome. I love y'all. Man, so it's good to be back. So last week was Labor Day weekend, and thank you, Mark and Martha, for filling in for us while we were gone. How did your trip go this week? Everything safely? Yeah, good. I appreciate you guys, man, so much, and for just allowing us to get away. We floated the river a couple days in New Braunfels, and man, it was fun, man. James told us like the week we were heading down there, like we're gonna be there just in case, you know. So, so kind of last minute, I was like, come on, man, let's do this together. So. Man, we had a good time on the river. It was just so fun just to get away and relax and not have to worry about anything. And you need that every now and then, right? So, like I said, today is Communion Sunday. I feel as if Easter was kind of stole from us this year. We were in the middle of a nationwide quarantine whenever Easter came around this last March or April. I think it was in March. Yeah, I think it was in March, end of March. But so we weren't able to get together and participate in Easter together. And so we tried to do it virtual, but it just didn't work out like the way I wanted it to. And so every Easter during the Passover season, we do communion. And so we're doing it today. We are having... if you will, we are having Easter in September. All right, so we're going to be doing some communion today, and it's always interesting whenever I have to focus the entire service around communion because generally communion happens at the end of a service or something like that, or at the end of the message, and so to make the entire message about communion is not necessarily a chore, but it's always interesting to me because there is so much history that is involved with what we are going to be participating in today. This cup that we will pass out at the end of service and the little wafer that is attached to the cup, I know that it's more modern, with the little cup and everything kind of pre-wrapped and everything else. So we kind of have to get our mindset out of this modern mentality and really focus on the meaning behind what we're doing. And so my goal today is to bring that to light, to help you as we unwrap the top of this cup and we participate in eating this little wafer today, what that means and remind you why we do that. And so I don't know about you, but history was boring to me when I was in school. I mean, when I was in high school and middle school, I hated history. I honestly asked myself, and I even remember asking my teacher, do you remember your history teacher's name when you was in high school? Mine was Miss Edwards, and she was not fun, all right? Just not fun. And I just remember Miss Edwards would tell me, Steve, just go to sleep so you don't interrupt the class. I mean, that's how bad it was in history in high school for me. And I would ask sometimes, like, why do we need to know this? Is there ever going to be a time in life where in order for us to get a job that we are asked, history questions? More than likely no, unless you have a certain kind of, I don't know, is there even a profession that, yeah, history teacher, there you go. So, but I just remember having that kind of mindset in the class that, why do I need to know this? And so I think we all have heard this saying, and I tried to do some research on where it came from, and I've got a little bit of a quote from a guy named George Santayana that it's probably spawned from as a philosopher. But we've all heard this quote that says that history repeats itself. You ever heard that before? History repeats itself. Can I ask you why? If we say that history repeats itself, why? Huh? I'm trying to hear like 4 people at one time. Y'all have to time this a little better. Because we fall asleep in history class. I like that. Because we never learn. Anybody else? Why does history, huh? Sinful nature of man. Okay, I like that. There's a quote from this guy George I was telling you about. It says, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Those that cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Kind of brings to light some of the things that are going on in our country, which is weird. We have actual people standing up for socialism today in our country. Do you know how much we fought against socialism in our history? And how many people have died because of socialism? So we have this tendency, and it said that if we don't remember the past, if we don't go out of our way to remember the past. And I'm not just talking about like a quiz that just says, hey, by the way, and let me just quiz you for a minute. What year was the American Revolution started? Close? What? Is that 1765? I heard 1760. That's what I heard. Yeah, and it went to, throw it up, Nina. I'm glad you didn't, preempt me on this one. The American Revolution occurred between the years of 1765 and 1783. What is the American Revolution? It is where America fought for our independence from Britain. And in fact, just a couple of Wikipedia here. The American Patriots in the 13 colonies defeated the British in the American Revolution War, gaining independence from the British Crown and establishing the United States of America, the first modern democracy in history's first nation explicitly founded as a democracy. Interesting, right? But most of us couldn't really shout out 1765. And I will be honest, I Googled it this morning, okay? So I'm not trying to be a hypocrite here. But I wonder why we as a nation, don't go out of our way to create certain traditions that are supposed to help us remember that. And I know we have Independence Day and stuff like that, but that has kind of been watered down into go buy fireworks and shoot off a bunch of fireworks or just barbecue, because that's the American thing to do. We don't really sit down with our kids and go through a certain amount of traditions and explain to them, like, look, there was a time where there was a king, and the king would have his way with people however he wanted to. And so would the king's men. The king's men could do whatever they wanted to as they pillaged villages, and they would tax without representation whatever they thought they could. We don't sit down with our kids and teach them this, especially over a 7-day period of time. And this is the beginning of what I want to get into called the Passover. Because as the Israelites, who were the chosen people of God way back in the Old Testament, at the beginning, as they were chosen by God, they entered a period of time where they say it's about 400 years, but this 400 years dates back to Isaac. But it was literally about 200 years where they were enslaved in Egypt. And we read throughout the Old Testament about how this group of people were enslaved so much that they were forced laborers, that they were beaten to create bricks. And in fact, it only even got worse. They were to create bricks of straw, and the material was provided for them at one point, but at another point, they were to keep up with the same quota and then go get their own materials. And this is how much this group of people that were chosen by God fell into slavery. And their cries over a 200-year period of time reached the ears of God. And I think that God heard them the entire time, but God knows history, and He knows when to step in and when not to. And so after a 200-year period of time, God chose to step into history and do something that would be commemorated by the Jews up until this day. And so we read a little bit. In fact, I'm going to go over a couple of things that was instructions for the Israelites to do. We're going to read some scriptures from Exodus so that we can kind of relive this and understand how they were challenged to never forget this. But it's interesting when you look at some of the detail. So in this thing called the Passover, I'm going to explain to you why it's called the Passover. But I want you to get this. This was about a 7-day period of time, a week, that the Lord instructed the Israelites while they were slaves in Egypt to prepare for his deliverance. And they were to prepare in a certain way. So the first thing was they were to set aside an unblemished lamb on the 10th day of Nisan, which is the Jews have their own year, and each month has a different name than our months are. And the traditions like Passover and the new moon festivals and all these things that you can read throughout the Old Testament and everything line up. Even today, they line up to the Jewish calendar. And so they were to set aside a lamb that was unblemished. An unblemished lamb was a lamb that didn't have any defects in it, okay? Animals at times are born with defects. Some of them are born blind. Some are born, it's obvious that they have a limp or something or another. But the Israelites were challenged to take their best lamb, the lamb that was perfect, the Bible says spotless, and take that lamb on the 10th day of Nisan and separate that lamb until the 14th day of Nisan. And on the 14th day of Nisan, they were to slaughter this lamb at dusk. Okay? So whenever the sun was setting and the sun was going down, it was time for them to slaughter this lamb. And you're going to see that there's a couple of things that seem fairly graphic in this process, but they're done for a reason. The next thing they were to do is to take the blood from this unblemished lamb and to smear this blood on the sides of the doorpost. They were to take a part of this blood and smear it on the sides of the doorpost and on the tops of the door frames, so that when the climax of what was about to take place happened, which is there would be a period where God came through, basically the presence of God came through Egypt and saw the blood on the doorframe, and that would be their protection from the slaughter of the firstborn of Egypt. Now, I'll try to explain this a little bit as we get along, but up until this point, God had chosen a man named Moses. And Moses came to Pharaoh, and it was literally the climax of the story of then when God showed up to challenge the authority of Pharaoh. Now, up until this point, Moses had been used to tell Pharaoh to let the Israelites go and to stop enslaving them. And Pharaoh, up until this point, just basically said no. And there was a series of plagues that swept Egypt during this time. And at the end of those plagues, this plague that we are talking about right now, the death of every firstborn of Egypt, was to be had. And this blood would be the sign of who was not only just an Israelite, but who was God's people. And as this happened, this blood would protect the Israelites. So they were told to do this. Now, they also were told, after they take this blood, to prepare this lamb to be eaten on the 15th day of Nisan. This is, again, as this calendar progresses. It was to be roasted and eaten at night without the removals of the entrails of the animal. So generally, when you killed an animal, you would remove its entrails and everything else. Well, this lamb was to be roasted with the entrails still in it. And all this is, it just seems, if you were to place yourself in Egypt at this time, this would be a little strange. But in hindsight now, we see how much this foreshadows what Jesus would be doing over 2,000 years in the future. And so, and it is to be eaten also with unleavened bread. And I don't know if you've ever eaten matzah or unleavened bread, but it is not great. And we will participate in some of this today. It is bread that doesn't have yeast in it, and it doesn't rise. It stays flat. It's like a cracker, and it's not like a Ritz cracker with salt and, nice stuff, okay? It is kosher. It is very dry and bland, and that is the cracker that the bread that they were to eat with this lamb that was roasted with the entrails still in it. Not a nice picture, not a great, dinner, And so here we go. And nothing on the next day was to be eaten. So as the sun came up on the 16th day of Nisan, nothing was to be eaten again. In fact, the rest of the lamb, whatever was left over, was to be burned, okay, as a sacrifice. It was to be burned. Nothing that was to be eaten. There's a lot of details in here if you begin to read some of this in Egypt, but they were told to basically, if another Israel was available that couldn't afford a lamb, they were to invite them over to their house. They were to participate in this together, and so on and so on. So the goal was to completely finish this lamb and not to have any leftovers, but if there were, the next day they were to burn it. Okay, so why is all this important? Why did I just take 10 minutes to describe everything that they had to do during this Passover, days? And I think that when you begin to look at all of this, it wasn't just a list of things that God put together that said, this sounds good. This was a list of things that they were to do in preparation of their exit out of Egypt and their escape from slavery into freedom, into the promised land. And the reason I brought up the American Revolution was because this was this is our way, I guess, of remembering our escape out of somewhat of some slavery, out of underneath the king, into freedom that we now experience. And so these traditions, these things that I just listed for you, were very important because they weren't just things, a way of preparing food. They were a way to remember the cost of freedom. And I want you to get that. Because God could have, in his infinite wisdom, he could have just came in and said, you know what? I'm done with Pharaoh. I'm done with y'all being slaves. This moment, bam! And then wiped everything out and just left the Israelites to have their own land. I mean, he could have done that. But why did God go out of his way to create all of these things for us to remember and for the Jews to commemorate? In fact, it says in Exodus 12:11, it says, this is how you are to eat it, with your cloak tucked into your belt, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. So the instructions on how this was to be eaten, fully dressed, with your sandals on, and fast. And it's to be eaten that way because your freedom is at hand. And so all of these things are important because as we list them out, we are to remember that this was what God went through specifically so that whenever generations would come after that, and generations would come after that, the Israelites could sit down and for 7 days they could go through this process so that their children and their children's children would never forget that they are free because of what God did in Egypt. And now we fast forward. We fast forward into the New Testament, and we have Jesus come. And Jesus is, even in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, called the spotless lamb without blame. Jesus now becomes the lamb. In fact, I got ahead of myself, but let me read this just to show you how we and the Jews were to commemorate this festival, this celebration. Exodus 12, 14, 17 says, "This is a day you are to what? For how long? For generations to come. You shall celebrate it as a what? As a festival to the Lord. A lasting what? Ordinance." How many different descriptions there is there to try to bring emphasis on how, number one, it is important, and how you're to never forget, how you're to celebrate it, and how you're to make sure that it is an ordinance that you and your family do. 15, "For 7 days you are to eat bread made without yeast. On the first day, remove the yeast from your house, for whoever eats anything with yeast in it from the first day through the seventh must be cut off from Israel." Verse 16, "On the first day, hold a sacred assembly, and another one on the seventh day. Do no work at all on these days, except to prepare the food for everyone to eat. That is all you may do." Verse 17, "Celebrate the festival." I also like how this just isn't, because a lot of times if we were just to kind of try to visualize what's going on in Egypt during this time, how they're preparing this lamb, you would think that would be very somber. As slaves, what do you have to celebrate? You work all day, you come home, you're I don't even know what kind of home you have, but you're sweaty, you're dirty, you've been slaving, you've probably been hit with the whip, that day a couple of times. You've been working all day in the heat, and you come home, what do you have to celebrate? Well, this also paints the picture that this is not just a process, but this is a festival. This is a celebrate, in verse 17, celebrate the festival of unleavened bread, because it was on that very day that I brought your divisions out of Egypt. Celebrate this day as a lasting ordinance for the generations to come. So hopefully, after we're done here, honestly and humbly remembering what Jesus went through, on the other side of that, we can also leave with a feeling of freedom and celebration as well, because it shouldn't just all be downer. And so this is how they were told to celebrate. Now, I made 2 points here. I want these to stick with you as we move forward. And these are kind of general. They're not necessarily scriptural points, but they're general points. There should be steps that we take and actions performed to recount the sacrifice of our history. Okay? And I think that this is obviously the history of the freedom that we have in the grace of God through the blood that was shed, but also as proud Americans, man. How many other countries get to go and wherever they want to and do whatever they want to, literally have the freedom to raise your family up and do the things that we get to do? And we take this sometimes for granted. And I want my boy to understand the country that he grew up in. And yes, according to this next point that I'm making, man, there's a history there that isn't pretty. It's bad. There's some really bad history. But it's okay to remember that. And so there should likewise be lasting festivals of celebration to communicate and relate the failures and accomplishments of our history as well. I mean, we should have festivals and celebrations to remember how we came out of slavery, man. That should be something that we celebrate as a nation. It's a stain on our past, but look at what we've come from. I mean, we've elected a black president. That's something to be proud of one way or another. That just goes to show you how much progress we've made. So there should be celebrations of look at where we came from. Look at our history. Look at where we came from. But also, on the other hand, on the spiritual side of this, you have to understand what the early Christians came out of. And as a church, every Sunday, all these songs that we sing, they should be a celebration of freedom in our life as believers. We should be able to remember the history of the Bible, and that there was a man that was fully God and fully flesh that came, that was tremendously beaten so that the blood didn't have to be shed on door frames, but instead could be put onto our life. And now whenever God looks at us, he doesn't see our sin, he sees Jesus, and we are forgiven because of that. That's freedom. That's something great to be celebrated, right? Every song, every word, it is something that we should celebrate. And the truth is that there's at times where we have to go out of our way to do that. Like when you walk in and you had a rough night the day before. Or maybe you just stayed up late playing video games. Or maybe you went to bed early because you weren't feeling good. And you walked into church this morning and you just didn't want to get out of bed. But you did. And you're here. And we get to celebrate our God together with other believers. That is amazing, man. People don't get to do that all over the globe. We have to go out of our way to remember our freedom. Not just our freedom of our nation, but the freedom that we have from sin. And the freedom that we have that one day, thank God, because of Jesus, our salvation will be a check that we cash. So let's look at this now in the New Testament as we get into the closing aspects to where we get to participate in this. Now we move forward. We're all of that timeline, and for centuries, for thousands of years, Jews celebrated the Passover. For 7 days at a time, every time they gathered their kids around, they didn't work, they prepared meals, they had bread that didn't have yeast in it. They purposely went out of their way to remember this. And now we reach the point of the story where Jesus himself, who all his life has celebrated this exact same thing. But the meaning of this celebration is about to change forever. The meaning of the Passover, up until the scripture that I'm about to read to you, where Jesus was in his last days of living, meant the same, but now it was about to change forever. So it says that as they were about to do the Passover in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 23 to 29, it says, "For I received from the Lord," this is Jesus speaking, "for I received from the Lord what I have passed on to you. The Lord Jesus, on the night that he was betrayed, on the exact night," there's another point that really stuck in my mind as I was studying this morning, is that all of this was created before it happened. Do you realize that? That it wasn't like they were delivered out of Egypt and then God said, "This is how I want you to prepare this lamb." This was all done in preparation of what would happen. That never really stuck out to me, because generally we celebrate things that have happened. The Passover and what Jesus is about to do was all celebrated and was all created before it happened. Took the bread, the night he was betrayed, he took bread, verse 24. "And when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.'" In the same way, after supper, he took a cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant." Everybody say new. That means that for ages, for thousands of years, there was an old covenant established under Abraham that was basically done in by circumcision. And circumcision was a big fight in the New Testament about this. But there was a new covenant that was about to be established here. And Jesus was taking a piece of bread and the cup and saying, whenever you do this in remembrance of me out of this new covenant that I'm about to establish. This cup, this new covenant is my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. So now, as we get a little bit further into this, there are key specifics and what we are supposed to do as we partake into this. But I want you to understand. Let's stand as we close, and I don't want you guys to pass this out yet because I really want this to hit home. I want this point to hit home. Everything that was done in the Old Testament through the Passover was about to be recreated through the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. This lamb that was to be taken and slaughtered was about to now become Jesus and was about to be taken to a cross and slaughtered. And the blood was instead of being used on door frames, was to be applied to our life. All of this now was to be established a new covenant. And as we relive this, as we rethink about this, I hope that every scene that you've seen in the Passion of Christ and every cross that you've seen and every church that you've driven by and every imagination that you could have ever imagined of how you could have put yourself there, I hope that never gets old to you. Because I want you to feel what it was like to stand there and watch Jesus be flogged as literally the skin on his back was shredded. And that's what this is about. This is about remembering that. And as a church, we have to be able to realize that all of that was done for our freedom. So now, guys, if you will pass out this cup, let's dim the lights in the house if we can. And I want you to go back. And I want you to put yourself there. And as we, in a minute, pray and partake, I don't want this juice to just be juice. And I don't want this wafer to just be wafers. I literally want you to imagine the blood of Jesus that was shed so that you could have salvation. It was a price that was paid for every one of us. But we've got to do this correctly. So as they're passing it out, you can prepare to take, but I don't want you to take yet. I don't want you to drink and eat yet. There's a couple of steps that I need to go over before we participate in this. In verse 26 of 1 Corinthians chapter 11, it says that for whenever you eat this bread, please listen. It says that whenever you eat this bread and you drink this cup, what you're doing is you are proclaiming the Lord's death until he comes. In other words, there is a time limit on this. We will do this until Jesus comes back. And then after he comes back, that will be the end of that chapter. But up until then, occasionally, what we are doing is we are proclaiming the Lord's death. And why is that so important? Because in order for there to be salvation, you have to believe in your heart and confess with your mouth that Jesus Christ died on the cross and was raised from the dead. So this isn't making you a believer. This is already saying, I believe. And this is just proclaiming the Lord's death. That's important. Verse 27. So then, whoever eats the bread and drinks the Lord and drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner is guilty of sinning against the body and the blood of the Lord. What does that mean? Well, it means this. Verse 28. Everyone ought to examine themselves before they eat the bread and drink the cup. For those who eat the bread and drink without discerning, what does discerning mean? It means making a decision. Without discerning the body of Christ, eat and drink judgment on themselves. So let me wrap this up real quick. We sat here with a cup. Can I get one, guys? Oh, or maybe just put it on my chair. As we sat here with a cup in front of us and a wafer in front of us, we are not only to recount the Lord's death, but we are to examine ourselves and why it was done. We are to remember that not only did he pay a price, but that today we still sin, and that price that he paid is still relevant for the covering of our sin today. And it's also recognizing that there still is today, there is sin in all of our lives. And because of that sin, Jesus died. So we're to take a moment and let that become real to us. And so we'll probably just do a moment of just with Chaz playing. And during this time, I don't like to say, okay, now everybody take. I like for you to take on your own time. It gives you an opportunity to think about this, to process it, to think about your own life, to think about your own sin, to thank God for his salvation, to recount the pain that was dealt to him because of our sin, and really just process it. And then I challenge you, and I ask, and I would challenge you to say, Lord, have mercy on me and forgive me of my sin and my shortcomings, and then partake of it yourself. So let's all join together and do that.